The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Preservation Heritage Lab in Knoxville, Tennessee, casting long rectangles across the polished concrete floor. Rebecca Torres sat at her restoration station, her attention fixed on the daguerreotype plate mounted under her magnification system. She had been working as a photograph conservator for 12 years, and in that time she had seen thousands of images from every era of American photography. But this particular plate, delivered 3 days ago from an estate auction in eastern Kentucky, had captured her interest in a way that few projects ever did. The photograph showed a farming family arranged in front of a tobacco barn, the weathered wooden structure typical of Appalachian agriculture in the late 19th century. The image was dated 1895 based on both the photographic technique and the clothing styles visible in the frame. 9 people appeared in the composition, arranged in the formal, slightly stiff poses that were necessary given the long exposure times required by cameras of that era. Men in work clothes and women in simple cotton dresses, their faces showing the weathered strength of people who worked the land for their survival. Rebecca had been restoring the image methodically, removing the oxidation that had accumulated over more than a century, correcting for the chemical degradation that affected all silver-based photographic processes. The work required patience and precision, adjusting levels and contrast in tiny increments, revealing details that had been obscured by time and environmental damage. She had reconstructed portions of the barn structure that had faded almost to invisibility, had brought definition back to faces that had blurred into the general darkness of the aged plate. It was during this detailed restoration work that she noticed something strange. 2 of the faces in the photograph were identical. Not similar, not related in the way that siblings or cousins might share family features, but absolutely identical. The same slightly crooked nose, the same distinctive eyebrows, the same shape to the jaw and cheekbones. One face belonged to a man standing near the center of the group, wearing work clothes and holding a farming implement. The other face belonged to a man positioned at the far left edge of the frame, dressed differently, his posture more formal, his hands clasped in front of him rather than holding any tool. Rebecca's first thought was technical error. Double exposure was not uncommon in 19th century photography, particularly when photographers were reusing expensive glass plates or when mechanical failures caused the shutter to open twice. But as she examined the image more closely, she realized this couldn't be a double exposure. Both figures were fully integrated into the scene, their positions in space consistent with the other people around them, their shadows falling in the correct directions based on the angle of sunlight. They were not ghostly overlays but solid, present individuals, photographed at the same moment as everyone else in the frame. Daniel, Rebecca called across the lab to her colleague, a specialist in 19th century photographic techniques who had helped her with difficult restorations before. "Come look at this. Tell me what you see." Daniel Cross was 53, with silver hair and the careful, analytical mind of someone who had spent decades studying the technical evolution of photography. He approached Rebecca's workstation, adjusting his glasses as he leaned in to examine the screen where she had the restored image displayed at high magnification. "Farm family portrait," he said, his voice neutral as he made his initial assessment. "Probably tobacco farmers based on the barn structure. Late 19th century, definitely. The plate quality suggests a professional photographer rather than an amateur. Good composition, well exposed. What am I supposed to be seeing?" Rebecca highlighted the 2 faces, using her digital annotation tools to draw circles around them and then displaying them side by side in a comparison window. "Look at these 2 men. Look carefully." Daniel was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between the 2 faces, studying them with the intensity that came from years of photographic analysis. Then he straightened up, removing his glasses and cleaning them on his shirt, a gesture Rebecca recognized as his response to something that puzzled him. "That's impossible," he said finally. "Those are the same person. Every feature matches. But they're clearly 2 different positions in the frame, 2 different poses, 2 different sets of clothing. How did the photographer achieve that? Some kind of early photomontage technique? Cut and paste with physical negatives?" "That's what I thought too," Rebecca said, pulling up her technical analysis. "But look at the integration. No edge artifacts, no differences in grain structure or tonal range. No evidence of physical manipulation of the plate. And see here, the man on the left, his elbow actually overlaps with the woman standing next to him. That's not something you could achieve with a simple paste-up technique. The spatial relationships are too complex, too integrated. They spent the next hour examining every detail of the photograph, using every analytical tool available in their digital restoration suite. They checked for signs of retouching, for evidence that the plate had been altered or manipulated after the initial exposure. They analyzed the light and shadow patterns, confirming that both figures were illuminated by the same sun angle as everyone else in the scene. They compared the background elements visible behind each figure, looking for any discontinuities that might suggest composite work. Every analysis pointed to the same conclusion. Both men had been present when the photograph was taken. They were not the result of technical manipulation or photographic trickery, which meant that the impossible was true. The same person appeared twice in a single photograph taken in 1895, before the era of sophisticated image manipulation, before the techniques that would have made such a deception possible. Twins, Daniel said suddenly. They have to be twins. Identical twins. That would explain the perfect facial match. Rebecca felt a surge of relief at the obvious explanation. Of course, identical twins would naturally have the same features, would appear to be duplicates in a photograph. She zoomed back out to look at the full image, examining the context more carefully now that she had a hypothesis to test. But even as she looked, doubts began to creep in. The two men were dressed differently, positioned at opposite ends of the family group. One seemed to be clearly part of the farming family, standing among them with the ease of belonging. The other stood slightly apart, his formal posture and different clothing suggesting he was somehow separate from the family unit, present but not quite part of the group. If they're twins, Rebecca said slowly, why are they dressed so differently? Why is one positioned with the family and the other standing apart? And look at the body language. The man in the center, he's comfortable, relaxed as much as anyone could be during a long exposure. But the man on the left, see how his shoulders are slightly raised, how his hands are clasped tightly. He looks uncomfortable, uncertain, like he's not sure he belongs in the photograph. Daniel studied the image again, this time paying attention to the subtle cues of posture and positioning that Rebecca had identified. You're right, he admitted. There's definitely something unusual about the composition. In typical family portraits from this era, twins would usually be positioned together, often dressed identically to emphasize their connection. This arrangement is strange. Almost like the photographer was trying to include both men but also trying to keep them separate. Rebecca felt the familiar excitement of a mystery beginning to unfold. Every restored photograph told a story, but some told stories that were hidden, that required careful investigation to uncover. This image was clearly one of those, a visual puzzle that held meaning beyond what was immediately apparent. We need to find out who these people were, she said, already opening her email to begin drafting inquiries. The plate came from an estate sale in Kentucky, right? There must be some provenance information, some record of whose estate it was found in. Over the next week, Rebecca pursued every lead she could find. The auction house that had handled the estate sale provided minimal information. The photograph had been found in a trunk of family papers belonging to the estate of Margaret Wheeler, who had died at age 97 without children. The estate had included the farmhouse and land in Harlan County, Kentucky, along with various household items and family documents that had been sold off to cover debts and legal fees. Rebecca contacted the Harlan County Historical Society, sending them high-resolution scans of the photograph and asking if anyone could identify the family or provide context about farming communities in that area in the 1890s. She reached out to genealogical societies, posted queries on historical photography forums, and even contacted a professor at the University of Kentucky who specialized in Appalachian social history. The responses trickled in slowly, each providing small pieces of information that gradually began to form a larger picture. The Harlan County Historical Society identified the barn structure as typical of tobacco farming operations in that region during the late 19th century. A genealogist recognized the surname Wheeler in connection with several farming families that had settled in eastern Kentucky after the Civil War. The university professor provided context about economic conditions in the Appalachian region during that period, explaining the hardships that mountain families faced and the difficult choices they sometimes had to make regarding children and family structure. But it was an email from an elderly woman named Ruth Patterson in Lexington, Kentucky, that provided the breakthrough Rebecca had been hoping for. Ruth explained that she was a distant cousin of the Wheeler family and that her grandmother had told her stories about the family history that had been passed down through generations. "There was always a sad story in our family about twins who were separated," Ruth wrote in her careful, old-fashioned prose. "My grandmother said it happened during the hard times of the 1890s, when crop failures and economic depression made it nearly impossible for farming families to survive. One of the Wheeler families had twin boys born in 1875, but they couldn't afford to feed and clothe both children along with their other kids. It was a choice between keeping both boys and watching the whole family starve, or finding a better situation for one of them. They made the terrible decision to let one twin be adopted by a more prosperous family in town, a merchant family that had no children of their own and could provide opportunities that a poor farming family never could." Rebecca read the email 3 times, feeling the emotional weight of the story settling over her. She had known intellectually that the 19th century had been a time of harsh economic realities, that families had sometimes been forced to make impossible choices. But reading about a specific case, about real people who had faced such a decision, made the historical knowledge feel immediate and painful. Ruth's email continued with more details. The twin who had remained with the farming family was named Thomas Wheeler. The twin who had been adopted was named Samuel, and he had taken the surname of his adoptive family, becoming Samuel Garrett. The 2 boys had grown up less than 20 miles apart but in completely different worlds. Thomas learned farming and tobacco cultivation, working alongside his father and siblings in the hard physical labor of mountain agriculture. Samuel received education and apprenticed in his adoptive father's mercantile business, learning bookkeeping and trade, preparing for a life as a shopkeeper or businessman. According to family stories that Ruth had heard, the twins had known about each other but had rarely seen one another during their childhood and adolescence. The separation had been painful for everyone involved, particularly for their mother, who had insisted on maintaining some connection even though the adoption had been intended to be complete. There were occasional visits, awkward encounters that emphasized how different the boys' lives had become, how much the separation had changed them despite their identical physical appearance. "The photograph you found," Ruth wrote, "if it really does show both twins together, it would be extraordinary. I've never seen any image that showed both Thomas and Samuel in the same frame." The family story says they came together for their father's funeral in 1895, and that was one of the few times in their adult lives that they were in the same place at the same time. It's possible that someone arranged for a family photograph to be taken during that gathering, wanting to document the rare moment when both sons were present. Rebecca immediately responded to Ruth, asking if she would be willing to share any other family documents or photographs she might have, and whether she knew of any other Wheeler or Garrett descendants who might have additional information. Ruth replied within days, sending scans of several other photographs and copies of letters that had been preserved in her family's papers. Among these documents was a letter dated September 1895, written by Martha Wheeler, the mother of the twins, to her sister in Virginia. The letter's tone was melancholic but also carried notes of relief and gratitude. Martha described the family gathering that had brought both her sons together, the first time in several years that she had seen Thomas and Samuel in the same place. She wrote about her conflicting emotions, pride in how well Samuel had done with his adoptive family, gratitude for the opportunities he had received, but also sadness about the years of separation, about not having raised both her boys together. "We had a photograph made," Martha wrote in her neat script. "Mr. Harrison, the traveling photographer, was passing through, and William insisted we document the occasion. Both my boys together, along with William and our other children and Samuel's adoptive mother, Mrs. Garrett, who was kind enough to attend despite her health troubles. When I look at that photograph, I see my 2 sons, identical in face but so different in bearing and dress, and I feel such a mixture of joy and sorrow that I can hardly express it. They are both fine men, both doing well in their different lives, but I cannot help but wonder what might have been if circumstances had been different, If we had been able to keep them both with us. Rebecca felt tears welling up as she read Martha's words. The photograph on her restoration table, which had started as a technical puzzle about duplicate faces, had revealed itself to be a document of profound family pain and love, a moment captured when two brothers, separated by economic necessity, had been briefly reunited. The different clothing, the separate positioning within the family group, all of it made sense now as visual representation of their different lives and identities. She immediately contacted Daniel to share what she had discovered. Together, they looked at the photograph again, this time seeing it not as a technical mystery but as a human story. They could now identify which twin was which. Thomas, in his work clothes, standing comfortably among his siblings and parents, was the one who had remained with the farming family. Samuel, in his more formal attire, standing slightly apart, was the one who had been raised in town, who had become someone different from his birth family. "Look at their mother," Daniel said quietly, pointing to a woman in the photograph who stood between the two groups, positioned almost exactly midway between her two sons. "She's the bridge. She's literally positioned herself to connect them, even in the composition of the photograph." Rebecca zoomed in on Martha Wheeler's face, seeing now what she had missed before. The woman's expression carried such complexity, such depth of emotion. Pride and sadness, joy and grief, all visible in the set of her mouth and the look in her eyes. This was a mother who had made an impossible choice and had lived with the consequences for 20 years, and now, in this photograph, she was seeing both her sons together, whole and well but separated by more than just physical distance. "We need to tell this story," Rebecca said. "This photograph deserves to be understood, to have its full meaning revealed. These people, this family, they deserve to be remembered not just as faces in an old image but as real people who faced terrible choices and somehow found ways to maintain love and connection despite everything." Rebecca spent the next several weeks immersed in research, working with Ruth Patterson and other Wheeler family descendants to piece together as complete a picture as possible of the twins' story and the family circumstances that had led to their separation. What emerged was a portrait of a time and place where economic survival often required heartbreaking decisions, but also a testament to the resilience of family bonds that persisted despite separation and hardship. Thomas and Samuel Wheeler had been born in March 1875 to William and Martha Wheeler, the fourth and fifth children in what would eventually be a family of 7. The twins arrived during a relatively prosperous period for the family. William had established a successful tobacco farm in Harlan County, and the work of raising tobacco, while demanding, provided enough income to support his growing family. The Wheeler children were not wealthy by any standard, but they had adequate food, shelter, and clothing, which was more than many mountain families could claim. But the agricultural economy of the Appalachian region was precarious, subject to the fluctuations of commodity prices and the unpredictable challenges of weather and disease. In the early 1880s, a series of crop failures devastated farming communities throughout eastern Kentucky. Tobacco prices collapsed due to overproduction in other regions. William Wheeler, like many of his neighbors, found himself struggling to feed his family, facing the real possibility of losing his farm to creditors. It was during this crisis period that Thomas Garrett, a prosperous merchant in the town of Harlan, approached William and Martha with a proposal. Garrett and his wife Helen had been married for 15 years but had no children. They had watched the Wheeler twins growing up, had noticed how bright and quick young Samuel was during the family's occasional visits to town for supplies and church services. They offered to take Samuel into their home, to raise him as their own son, to provide him with education and opportunities that William and Martha could never afford. The decision had been agonizing. Martha, according to letters and family recollections preserved by descendants, had initially refused outright. The idea of giving up one of her children was unthinkable, a betrayal of everything she believed about motherhood and family. But as the economic situation worsened, as she watched all her children growing thinner, as the reality of potential starvation became undeniable, she began to reconsider. William had been more pragmatic from the start. He loved his children fiercely, but he also understood the harsh mathematics of survival. If keeping both twins meant the entire family might not survive the winter, then finding a good home for one of them became not just acceptable but necessary. The Garretts were good people, church-going and respected in the community. They would provide Samuel with advantages that no Wheeler child would ever have access to. It wasn't abandonment, William argued, it was giving their son a chance at a better life. The final decision was made in late 1882, when Samuel was 7 years old. The arrangement was formalized through legal adoption papers, though with the informal understanding that some connection between Samuel and his birth family would be maintained. Samuel moved to the Garrett home in town, beginning his new life as a merchant's son while his twin brother Thomas remained on the farm, continuing the life they had both been born into. Rebecca found accounts of that separation in letters between Martha Wheeler and her sister. The pain was evident in every line. Martha described watching Samuel leave with the Garretts, seeing him look back repeatedly as they drove away in their carriage. She wrote about Thomas's confusion and grief, how the 7-year-old boy had cried for his missing twin, how he had searched the house looking for his brother, unable to fully comprehend why Samuel was suddenly gone. But she also wrote, later, about visits, about maintaining connection despite the separation. The Garretts, to their credit, had honored their informal agreement to allow some contact. Samuel visited the farm several times a year, awkward occasions that emphasized how rapidly he was becoming someone different. He learned to read and write while Thomas learned to plow and plant. He wore store-bought clothes while Thomas wore homemade garments patched and mended multiple times. He spoke with growing refinement while Thomas retained the mountain dialect of their community. Yet through all these changes, one thing remained constant. When the twins stood side by side, they were mirror images, physically indistinguishable. That identical appearance served as a constant reminder of their shared origin, of the bond that existed despite all the differences that adoption had created. Daniel helped Rebecca track down additional photographic evidence of the twins' separate lives. They found a formal portrait of Samuel taken around 1890, when he was 15, showing him in the clothing and setting of a prosperous merchant family. The image had been made in a professional studio in Lexington, Kentucky, the kind of establishment that catered to wealthy clients. Samuel sat in an upholstered chair, wearing a suit, his hair neatly trimmed, his expression serious and composed. Everything about the portrait communicated respectability and social status. In contrast, they found no formal portraits of Thomas from his youth. Farming families rarely had the resources for professional photography, and Thomas's existence was documented only in family snapshots and the occasional group photograph taken at church or community gatherings. In these images, he appeared in work clothes, usually outdoors, often with farm implements or animals visible in the frame. His life was recorded casually, informally, in sharp contrast to Samuel's carefully staged portraits. The photograph from 1895 is even more significant than we initially realized, Daniel observed as they compared the two sets of images. It's not just documentation of the twins being together. It's visual evidence of two completely different life trajectories, two different social worlds captured in a single frame. Look at how the photographer composed it. The two young men at opposite ends of the group, their mother in the center, literally holding the family together across that divide. Rebecca had been corresponding regularly with Ruth Patterson and had also made contact with other Wheeler descendants. One of these was James Wheeler, Thomas's great-grandson, who lived in Cincinnati and worked as a high school history teacher. James had extensive family records, including journals and account books that had been passed down through Thomas's line of the family. He was thrilled to learn about the photograph and eager to share what he knew about his ancestor's life. "My great-grandfather Thomas lived his entire life on that farm," James told Rebecca during their first phone conversation. "He married young, had 6 children, worked the land until he was too old to continue. By all accounts, he was a good man, a hard worker, devoted to his family. But there was always a sadness in him, according to the stories that got passed down. The sense of something missing, someone missing. He maintained contact with Samuel throughout their lives, visited him occasionally in town, exchanged letters. But they were never close the way twins raised together might have been." James sent Rebecca copies of letters between the twins, correspondence that spanned decades and documented the evolution of their relationship. The early letters from adolescence were brief and awkward, full of the stiffness of people who shared blood but not daily life. Samuel wrote about his schooling and his apprenticeship in the store. Thomas wrote about crops and weather and farm animals, his letters showing the limitations of his education but also revealing intelligence and curiosity. As the years passed, the letters became more substantial, more revealing. Both brothers married in their 20s. Thomas married a local girl from a farming family, someone who understood the rhythms of agricultural life. Samuel married the daughter of a banker from Lexington, a match that strengthened his position in the merchant class. They wrote to each other about their wives, their children, their hopes and struggles. But woven through all these letters was an undercurrent of complex emotion. Samuel expressed guilt about his advantaged position, about the education and opportunities he had received while Thomas had worked in tobacco fields. Thomas expressed pride in Samuel's accomplishments but also a tinge of envy, a wonder about what his own life might have been like if he had been the twin chosen for adoption. Neither explicitly blamed their parents for the decision, but the weight of that choice was present in everything they wrote. Rebecca found the most emotionally powerful letter in a batch that James sent from Thomas's papers. It was dated 1894, a year before the photograph was taken, written by Thomas to Samuel during a particularly difficult period on the farm. Crop disease had destroyed much of that year's tobacco harvest, and Thomas was facing potential financial ruin, the same kind of crisis that had led to the twins' separation decades earlier. "Brother," Thomas wrote, his handwriting showing the strain of limited education but also the clarity of genuine emotion, "I find myself in a position not unlike what our parents faced when we were boys. I have 6 children and a failing crop and debts that may take everything. Sometimes in the dark hours before dawn, I wonder if I should do what they did, should find better situations for some of my children with families that have more resources. But I cannot bring myself to it. I remember too well what it felt like when you left, how incomplete I was without you, how I searched for you every day for months afterward. I cannot inflict that on my own children, cannot tear my family apart even if it means we all struggle together. Perhaps this makes me foolish or proud or both. But it is the only choice I can make." Samuel's response came quickly, and it was both generous and painful to read. He offered financial help, a loan that he promised would carry no expectation of rapid repayment. He wrote about his own life of relative comfort and how it had been built on the sacrifice Thomas and his parents had made. He acknowledged that Thomas had paid the price for Samuel's advantages, that the separation had benefited one brother at the emotional cost of the other. "I have spent my life grateful for what the Garretts gave me," Samuel wrote, "but also conscious that my gain was achieved through our family's loss. You stayed and helped on the farm. You worked while I studied. You remained a Wheeler while I became a Garrett. All my prosperity rests on that foundation of your sacrifice, and I have never forgotten it. If I can ease your burden now, it is the least I can do to balance accounts that can never truly be balanced." This correspondence provided crucial context for understanding the 1895 photograph. When William Wheeler died in September of that year, both his sons came together for the funeral, traveling from their separate lives to stand at their father's grave. It was during that gathering, according to family accounts, that Martha had insisted on having a photograph made, on documenting this rare moment when both her sons were present, when the family was, briefly, whole again. Rebecca found an account of the photograph session in a letter from Martha to her sister, written a few weeks after William's funeral. "Mr. Harrison the photographer happened to be passing through, working his way through the mountain counties with his camera and equipment. When I learned he was in the area, I begged William's brother to fetch him, to pay him to make a portrait of all of us together. It cost more money than we could properly afford, but I felt it was essential. I wanted an image that would show both my sons, Thomas and Samuel, together in one frame. I wanted proof that they are brothers, that they belong to the same family despite all the years and circumstances that have kept them apart." The letter continued with Martha's description of the photograph session itself, details that helped Rebecca understand the composition and positioning that had initially puzzled her. "Mr. Harrison arranged us all in front of the tobacco barn, said the structure would make a good background. He placed Thomas in the center with his siblings, as Thomas has always been the one who stayed, the one who belongs to the farm. He placed Samuel at the edge, with Mrs. Garrett beside him, because Samuel's life has been elsewhere, in town, in business. I asked Mr. Harrison if he could position me between them, so that in the picture I would be connecting them, my two boys who share my blood but not their daily lives. He understood what I wanted and composed the scene accordingly. When I look at that photograph, I see my whole family and also our family's wound, the separation that saved us but also broke us. Reading Martha's words, Rebecca felt a profound sense of connection across more than a century of time. The photograph that had started as a technical puzzle had become a window into a specific family's pain and love, into choices made under impossible circumstances, into the ways that economic necessity could fracture families while bonds of affection struggled to hold them together. This is more than just a historical photograph, Rebecca told Daniel as they prepared their research for presentation. This is a document of social history, of how economic systems forced families into terrible choices, of how adoption and separation functioned in the 19th century. It's also a testament to the persistence of family love, to how Martha and William and their children tried to maintain connection despite everything that worked against it. Daniel nodded, looking at the photograph with new appreciation for all the layers of meaning it contained. The duplicate face that caught your attention, it's the visual key to understanding everything else. The identical twins, separated by adoption, standing together in one photograph. It's a powerful metaphor for how families can be divided but also how they remain connected, how identity can split and double, how one life can contain multiple possibilities depending on circumstances beyond anyone's control. With the full story of the Wheeler twins now understood, Rebecca began preparing an exhibition that would present the photograph in its complete historical and emotional context. She partnered with the East Tennessee History Center in Knoxville, which had a strong program of exhibitions focused on Appalachian social history. The curator, Margaret Chin, was immediately enthusiastic about the project, recognizing the photograph's significance as both a historical document and a human story. What makes this particularly powerful, Margaret said as they planned the exhibition, is that it's not about exceptional people or unusual circumstances. It's about ordinary families facing the economic realities of their time and making decisions that modern viewers can understand even if they might judge them differently. Twin separation due to adoption is a very specific historical practice that was actually relatively common in the 19th century, though it's rarely documented this explicitly in photographic evidence. Together, they designed an exhibition that would trace the full arc of the Wheeler twins' story, from their birth through their separation, their parallel lives, and the brief reunions they managed to achieve. The centerpiece was Rebecca's restored version of the 1895 photograph, enlarged to nearly life-size, with detailed annotations explaining who each person was and what their relationship to the twins had been. Surrounding this central image were the supporting documents that had helped piece together the story: letters, genealogical records, other photographs of the twins from different periods of their lives, maps showing the geographical proximity of the farm and the town where Samuel had been raised. But Margaret wanted the exhibition to go beyond just telling one family's story. She worked with Rebecca to create contextual panels that explained the broader social and economic forces that had shaped the Wheeler family's experience. One section discussed the agricultural economy of the Appalachian region in the late 19th century, explaining how vulnerable farming families were to crop failures, price fluctuations, and debt. Another section explored adoption practices of the era, particularly the informal arrangements through which children were transferred from poor families to more prosperous ones. "We need to help visitors understand that Martha and William weren't monsters," Margaret explained. "They were desperate parents trying to ensure all their children survived. The decision to let Samuel be adopted probably saved the entire family from starvation. But we also need to acknowledge the emotional cost, the trauma of separation, the way these practices disrupted identity and family structure. It's complicated history, and we should present it as complicated rather than trying to simplify it into heroes and villains." Rebecca reached out to both James Wheeler, Thomas's descendant, and to a man named Robert Garrett, who was descended from Samuel's line. Both men agreed to participate in the exhibition to provide family perspectives on the story that the photograph told. Robert had his own collection of family materials, including letters and photographs from Samuel's life, and he was eager to see how those documents connected with the materials from Thomas's side of the family. The two men met for the first time at the History Center during the exhibition planning phase. Rebecca watched with fascination as they compared notes, shared family stories, and discovered connections they had never known existed. They looked nothing alike, generations of different marriages having diluted any physical resemblance, but they carried forward the legacy of those twin brothers who had shared a face but lived separate lives. "My family always knew we had relatives on the farming side," Robert said, looking through the letters and photographs that James had brought. "But we'd lost touch, didn't know names or specific connections. My great-great-grandfather Samuel apparently felt some guilt about his advantages, about how he'd been given opportunities that his twin never had. He made sure his children knew about Thomas, about the farm family they came from. But over generations, that knowledge became vaguer, less specific. Now, seeing all this documentation, seeing Thomas's letters and learning about his life, it makes the connection real again." James was equally moved by the materials from Samuel's side of the family. "We knew about Samuel, knew he'd been adopted and had done well in business. But there was always a sense of, not quite resentment, but maybe questioning. Why had Samuel been chosen? What made him different from Thomas? The letters you've brought, where Samuel talks about feeling grateful but also guilty, where he acknowledges that his advantages came at a cost to his brother and his birth family, that helps answer those questions. He didn't forget where he came from. He recognized the sacrifice. They spent hours together, these two descendants of separated twins, piecing together a more complete picture of their shared ancestry. They discovered that Thomas and Samuel had maintained contact throughout their lives, that the 1895 photograph was not the only time they had come together. There had been other family gatherings, weddings and funerals and occasional social visits, times when the brothers managed to bridge the distance between their different worlds. One particularly touching discovery was a pair of pocket watches. Thomas had kept a simple brass watch that had belonged to his father William. Samuel had purchased an expensive gold watch as a mark of his mercantile success. According to family accounts, on their 40th birthday in 1915, the brothers had exchanged these watches as a symbolic gesture, each taking a material object that represented the other's life. Thomas had carried Samuel's gold watch for the rest of his life, though it must have seemed incongruous with his worn farmer's clothes. Samuel had kept Thomas's brass watch in his desk drawer, taking it out regularly to wind it and remember his brother and the life he might have lived. Both watches still existed, preserved by descendants. James had Thomas's gold watch, passed down through the family as a treasured heirloom. Robert had Samuel's brass watch, kept in a safety deposit box but brought out occasionally for family gatherings. For the exhibition, both men agreed to loan these watches, displaying them side by side as physical evidence of the connection that had persisted between the twins despite all the forces that had worked to separate them. As the exhibition took shape, Rebecca continued her restoration work on the photograph, bringing out details that had been obscured by time and damage. She found that the longer she worked with the image, the more she saw in it. The expressions on faces became more nuanced, more complex. The positioning of bodies and the arrangement of the group took on additional layers of meaning. Every element of the composition seemed to tell part of the larger story. One detail that particularly struck her was the hands. In 19th-century portrait photography, the positioning of hands was often significant, conveying meaning through formal gesture and placement. In this photograph, the hands told their own story. Thomas's hands, roughened by farm work, held a tobacco stick, the tool of his trade and the symbol of his life. Samuel's hands, softer and more refined, were clasped together, empty of any implement, representing his merchant's life of commerce rather than manual labor. But the most significant hands belonged to Martha Wheeler, positioned in the center of the composition. Her right hand reached slightly toward Thomas, her left hand reached slightly toward Samuel, as if even in the stillness of the photographed moment she was trying to maintain physical connection with both her sons, to bridge the gap that circumstances had created. The gesture was subtle, would be easy to miss unless you were looking for it, but once Rebecca noticed it, she couldn't unsee it. Martha's hands, reaching for her separated children, trying to hold together a family that had been fractured by economic necessity. Margaret incorporated this observation into the exhibition materials, using an enlarged detail of Martha's hands as one of the key visual elements. "This is what makes photography such a powerful historical medium," she explained to the exhibition team. "It captures not just faces and facts but emotion, relationship, the subtle physical expressions of love and loss that written records often miss." Martha Wheeler's hands, reaching for her sons, tell us more about her experience than any document could. The exhibition opened in March 2024, timing that was intentional, matching the birth month of the Wheeler twins. The response was overwhelming. Local media covered the opening, drawn by the unusual story of the duplicate face and the historical drama it had revealed. But the exhibition resonated beyond just local interest. National publications picked up the story, recognizing its relevance to contemporary discussions about adoption, economic inequality, and family separation. Visitors came in large numbers, drawn by the photograph's technical mystery but staying for the human story it told. Rebecca watched people spend long minutes in front of the central image, studying the faces of the Wheeler family, looking back and forth between Thomas and Samuel, reading Martha's expression, absorbing the weight of choices made more than a century ago. She saw visitors crying, saw them holding their own children a little closer, saw them engaged in intense discussions about poverty and family and the decisions that people make when all choices are difficult. The History Center received numerous messages from visitors sharing their own family stories of separation and adoption, of economic hardship that had forced painful decisions, of twins and siblings who had been raised apart. The Wheeler family's experience, specific as it was to 1890s Appalachia, touched on themes that remained universally relevant: the fragility of family in the face of economic pressure, the persistence of love across separation, the ways that identity can split and double when circumstances force divergent paths. James Wheeler and Robert Garrett both spoke at the exhibition opening, standing together in front of the photograph that showed their twin ancestors. James talked about the farming life that Thomas had lived, about the continuity of place and tradition that had defined Thomas's experience. He spoke with pride about his ancestors' hard work and dedication, about the way Thomas had maintained his family despite economic challenges that might have broken a less determined person. Robert talked about Samuel's life in town, about his success in business and his involvement in civic affairs. But he also talked about Samuel's letters, about the sense of displacement and divided loyalty that had characterized Samuel's existence. "My great-great-grandfather achieved material success," Robert said, "but he paid for it with a kind of fundamental loneliness, a sense of being separated from his roots, from his twin, from the life he might have lived. He was grateful for his advantages but haunted by the cost of those advantages." That complexity, that mixture of gratitude and grief, apparently passed down through the generations, because I recognize it in my own family's stories about where we come from. The most powerful moment of the opening came when James and Robert stood side by side in front of the photograph, unconsciously mirroring the pose of their twin ancestors in the image. Someone in the audience noticed the parallel and pointed it out, and suddenly everyone in the room was aware of the visual echo. Two descendants of separated twins, standing together more than a century later, reunited in a way that their ancestors had never quite been able to achieve. "This is what the photograph has made possible," Margaret said in her closing remarks at the opening. "Not just the preservation of faces and facts, but the restoration of connection, the recovery of stories that might otherwise have been lost." Thomas and Samuel Wheeler lived separate lives but maintained their bond as best they could. Now, through the work of photograph restoration and historical research, their descendants have found each other and can share the full story of where they come from. That's the power of this work, the reason it matters. After the formal program ended, Rebecca found herself approached by dozens of visitors, all of them wanting to know more about the restoration process, about how the duplicate face had been discovered, about the research that had uncovered the full story. She patiently explained her methods, showed examples of the analytical tools she had used, described the collaborative nature of historical investigation. But what moved her most were the visitors who simply thanked her for caring enough to investigate, for not dismissing the duplicate face as a technical error, for pursuing the mystery until she understood what the photograph was really showing. "You gave them back their story," one elderly woman said, tears streaming down her face. "Those people in the photograph, that family, they matter again because you took the time to figure out who they were and what they experienced. That's a kind of resurrection, bringing people back from being forgotten. The exhibition's success led to additional opportunities to share the Wheeler twins' story with wider audiences. Rebecca was invited to present her research at conferences on photograph conservation and historical investigation. She published an article in a major journal devoted to 19th-century American photography, analyzing the technical aspects of the image while also discussing the social history it documented. The article was widely cited, becoming a case study for how careful restoration and research could reveal hidden layers of meaning in historical photographs. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the way the story inspired other researchers to look more carefully at their own collections, to investigate anomalies and mysteries rather than dismissing them as technical errors or irrelevant details. Rebecca began receiving inquiries from archives and historical societies across the country, asking her to examine photographs that showed unusual features or raised questions that had never been adequately answered. Each investigation revealed new stories, new insights into the past, new connections between historical evidence and contemporary understanding. One such investigation involved a photograph from a West Virginia coal mining community that showed a group of workers with what appeared to be duplicate faces. Rebecca's analysis revealed that these were not twins but rather a case of a photographer creating a composite image to include workers from different shifts, men who could never have been photographed together because they worked opposite schedules. The technique told a story about labor conditions, about the demands of industrial mining operations that ran 24 hours a day, about communities where men worked underground and rarely saw sunlight. The duplicate faces, like the Wheeler twins' identical appearance, became a visual key that unlocked broader historical understanding. Daniel, inspired by Rebecca's work on the Wheeler photograph, began his own research project examining family portraits from the Appalachian region, looking for visual evidence of adoption, fostering, and other practices through which children were transferred between households. He discovered that such arrangements were far more common than historical records typically acknowledged, that many 19th-century photographs contained subtle clues about complex family structures that formal documents obscured or ignored. Photography has this capacity to reveal what written records hide, Daniel explained during a joint presentation he gave with Rebecca. Official documents treat adoption as a legal transaction, complete and final. But photographs often show the emotional reality, the ongoing connections, the way that families maintained bonds despite formal separations. In the Wheeler photograph, we see both twins included in a family portrait made years after the adoption, visible evidence that the separation was legal but not absolute, that blood relationships persisted even when social and economic circumstances had divided the family. The research also inspired academic work beyond the field of photography. Historians of Appalachian society began using the Wheeler case as a starting point for broader investigations into economic conditions and family strategies during the late 19th century. Sociologists interested in adoption practices found in Thomas and Samuel's story a valuable case study of how informal adoptions functioned and what impact they had on all parties involved. Genealogists recognized the photograph as an example of how visual evidence could supplement documentary records, providing information about family relationships that might otherwise remain obscure. Ruth Patterson, the distant cousin who had first provided crucial information about the Wheeler family history, became actively involved in genealogical research, motivated by seeing how much the photograph had revealed. She began systematically organizing all the Wheeler family papers she had inherited, cataloging letters and documents, scanning photographs, creating a comprehensive archive that would be available to future researchers. She donated the collection to the Kentucky Historical Society, ensuring that Thomas and Samuel's story would be preserved and accessible. "I'm 93 years old," Ruth said during the donation ceremony, "and I've spent most of my life knowing these family stories but not really understanding their significance. Seeing what Rebecca discovered in that photograph, seeing how people responded to Thomas and Samuel's story, it made me realize that our family history isn't just private memory. It's part of larger historical patterns, part of understanding how ordinary people lived and struggled in the past. I want to make sure all this material is preserved properly, that future researchers can access it, that my family's story can contribute to broader historical knowledge. James Wheeler and Robert Garrett maintained the connection they had formed through the exhibition. They began collaborating on a more complete family history, combining materials from both branches of the Wheeler family, documenting how one family had diverged into two distinct lineages through adoption but had maintained awareness of shared origins. They involved their own children and grandchildren in the project, teaching younger generations about Thomas and Samuel and the circumstances that had separated them. "What's remarkable," James said during one of their working sessions, "is how much emotional resonance this story still has, even for people who never knew Thomas or Samuel personally. My kids are 6 generations removed from those twins, but when they look at that photograph, when they hear the story, they feel it. They understand immediately what it means, why it matters." That kind of emotional connection across time is what makes family history powerful. Robert agreed, adding his own perspective. "I think people respond to the fundamental unfairness of the situation, the way economic circumstances forced a family to make an impossible choice. But they also respond to the love, the way Martha and William and the whole family tried to maintain connection despite the separation. It's a story about what we're willing to sacrifice for survival, but also about what we refuse to give up, what we fight to preserve even when everything works against us." The two men arranged for both families to gather together, a reunion that brought together descendants of Thomas and Samuel for the first time in living memory. They met at the site of the original Wheeler farm in Harlan County, which had long since ceased being worked but where the tobacco barn from the 1895 photograph still stood, weathered but recognizable. More than 40 people attended, representing 5 generations of Wheeler descendants from both branches of the family. Rebecca and Margaret were invited to attend the reunion, to see how their work had facilitated this connection. Rebecca brought enlarged copies of the photograph for each family member, along with packets of the research materials that documented the twins' story. She watched as family members examined the image, identifying Thomas and Samuel, pointing out other relatives, comparing the faces in the photograph to living descendants who showed traces of the same features. The most moving moment came when the entire group posed for a new photograph in front of the old tobacco barn, consciously recreating the composition of the 1895 image. They arranged themselves in similar positions, trying to match the spatial relationships of the original. But unlike that earlier photograph, which had documented separation and loss even while showing family unity, this new image captured genuine reunion, the coming together of family lines that had diverged but had now found their way back to connection. "This is what our great-great-great-grandparents wanted but couldn't quite achieve," one of the younger family members said as they posed for the photograph. They wanted to be one family, wanted Thomas and Samuel to remain brothers despite their different circumstances. "It took 5 generations, but we finally managed to do what they couldn't. We've brought the family back together." After the photograph was taken, the families shared a meal together, exchanged stories, made plans to maintain the connections they had established. Children played together in the field where Thomas and Samuel had once worked as boys. Adults compared notes on family traditions and characteristics, discovering shared traits and behaviors that had persisted through generations despite the family's division. Rebecca stood slightly apart from the gathering, watching the scene with a profound sense of fulfillment. Her work of photograph restoration had always been about preservation, about saving images from decay and loss. But this project had shown her that restoration could also be about connection, about using historical evidence to bring people together, to help them understand their origins and relationships in ways that would have been impossible without the visual record that photography provided. "You did this," Margaret said, coming to stand beside Rebecca. "Your curiosity about that duplicate face, your refusal to accept simple explanations, your persistence in researching until you understood the full story. Without you, this family would still be fragmented, these descendants would never have known about each other. That's the real value of what we do, not just preserving the past but making it available in ways that can shape the present and future." Rebecca felt tears welling up, moved by the scene before her and by Margaret's recognition of her role in creating it. "I just followed the evidence," she said. "The photograph told me there was a story, and I wanted to understand what it was. Everything else followed from that basic impulse to know, to understand, to reveal what had been hidden. As the afternoon light lengthened, casting shadows across the field that recalled the impossible shadows in the original photograph, Rebecca thought about Silas Blackburn, the traveling photographer who had made that 1895 image. She wondered if he had understood what he was documenting, if he had recognized the significance of capturing both twins together in a single frame. She wondered if he could have imagined that more than a century later, his photograph would facilitate the reunion of the family he had documented in their moment of division. Photography, Rebecca had come to understand through this project, was more than just technical documentation. It was a form of witness, a way of testifying to the reality of lives lived and relationships maintained. The photograph of Thomas and Samuel Wheeler, identical twins standing at opposite ends of a family portrait, their duplicate faces revealing their shared origin even as their different clothing and positioning showed their divergent paths, had become a powerful statement about family, separation, and the persistence of connection across all obstacles. The story didn't end with the reunion. James and Robert continued their family history project, gradually uncovering more details about Thomas and Samuel's lives and about the broader Wheeler family. They discovered that Thomas had lived until 1947, dying at age 72 after a life spent entirely on the farm where he had been born. Samuel had lived until 1952, reaching 77 and spending his final years retired from business but active in community affairs in Harlan. The brothers had maintained contact throughout their lives, letters preserved in both family lines documenting a relationship that was affectionate but also complicated by the circumstances of their separation. In their final years, according to family accounts, they had spent more time together, perhaps recognizing that their remaining time was limited and wanting to make the most of the connection they had maintained despite all the forces that had worked to divide them. One particularly touching detail emerged from letters written by Samuel shortly before his death. He had written to Thomas expressing gratitude for Thomas's acceptance of him, for never having blamed him for being the twin who was chosen for adoption, for maintaining brotherhood despite the inequality of their circumstances. "I have lived a comfortable life," Samuel wrote, "but you have lived an honest one, rooted in family and land and continuity. I do not know which of us was truly more fortunate. Perhaps neither, perhaps both. What I know is that you are my brother, my twin, the other half of who I am, and I am grateful that our parents found a way to keep us connected despite everything that might have separated us completely." Thomas's response, preserved among Samuel's papers, was brief but deeply felt. "You are my brother. That has never changed and never will. What happened to us when we were 7 was not of our making, was not our choice. We have done the best we could with the lives we were given. That is all anyone can do. When my time comes, I hope to see you again, and perhaps in whatever comes next, we will not be separated, will not have to live apart as we have in this world." Rebecca included these final letters in an expanded version of the exhibition, which traveled to additional venues over the following years. The letters provided a conclusion to Thomas and Samuel's story, showing that despite all the challenges and complications of their separated lives, they had maintained their bond, had valued their connection, had found ways to be brothers even when circumstances had divided them. 5 years after the initial discovery of the duplicate face in the photograph, Rebecca was invited to give a keynote address at a major conference on family history and visual documentation. She used the Wheeler twins story as her central case study, walking the audience through the entire journey from technical mystery to historical understanding to family reunion. She showed the original photograph with its duplicate faces, explained the research process that had revealed the story behind the image, shared documentation of the ongoing connections between Wheeler descendants.